Good evening. I'm Neil Kirkwood, Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the Design School, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2007 Daniel Urban Kiley Lecture presented by the Landscape Department. And in particular, I'd like to welcome back tonight our department's alumni, as well as some of the design practitioners from the Boston area. The Kiley Fund and public lecture was set up to honor Dan Kiley and his contributions to the landscape field, and continues to allow us to recognize distinguished landscape architects and architects through this annual lecture event. And as many of you know, Kiley attended the GSD in the mid-1930s, and between 39 and 40, with fellow students Garrick Ekvo and James Rose, their seminal manifesto on modernist landscape architecture was published. And it's to this legacy and that of Dan's long, energetic, and creative design career that we pay particular homage tonight. In Dan's own words, the greater purpose of design was to seek a wholeness in life, and he added in his own spirited way that, quote, despite everything, life should be joyful, and there should be a sense of fun and excitement in what you are doing. Design can raise people's level of consciousness and heightened awareness of the unity of truth, nature, beauty, and ourselves, end of quote. This year's lecture by landscape architect Craig Verzone and architect Cristina Woods breaks with the single lead practitioner tradition of previous years in inviting two collaborating designers whose partnership and resulting office, Verzone Woods, founded in 1995, has advanced in a unified and transformative way the interdisciplinary practice and overlapping realms of design in landscape, architecture, and urban design. And in doing so, they have produced permanent as well as temporary built works that bridge these respective fields as expressions of contemporary site actualities and concerns. Craig Verzone studied landscape architecture at Cornell University and urban design here at the GSD. Cristina Woods graduated from Harvard College in the VES, Visual and Environmental Studies program, with a focus on painting and photography, followed by a master's degree in architecture here from the GSD. And in 1995, they established their collaborative practice in the Swiss Alps, while also setting down professional roots in Barcelona in northern Spain. Immediately, they were invited to collaborate with architect Bruno Rechlin on the landscape at the base of Le Corbusier's Unité de Habitation, which was completed in 1999 as their first public park. In 1998, Craig won the Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture and spent a year at the American Academy in Rome studying the landscape of post-war collective housing on the periphery of that city. And Craig and Cristina's design process relies upon the observation of historic and contemporary models of made landscapes and places so that as to generate new ones. They pursue invention and explore the intersections, the in-between of landscape architecture, and urban design realms, in which the presence of compressed moments are transformed into the spatial reality of waterfronts, parks, gardens. Current collaborative practice work includes the landscape planning and design of new villages in the Pyrenees, public parks and gardens in the expanding cities of Huesca and Zaragoza, public spaces for Swiss alpine villages, and private gardens. Additionally, they have recently completed a 4-volume landscape master plan for Switzerland's Canton of Vaud, which includes an analysis of the rural territory, a palette of landscape typologies, and a series of pilot projects aimed at framing the major challenges confronting the temporary landscape. Cristina is also leading the current architectural work that includes the interior transformation of an early 19th century church, the conversion of a World War II military subterranean fort into a center for alternative medicine, and the oversight of a dozen state-owned buildings listed as historic monuments. Collaboration, as we know, is that difficult exchange between different minds with, we hope, common objectives. The design of the landscape or built environment does not fall, by its very definition, into any single design discipline. Few agencies, groups, or design individuals have the interest, understanding, or control over all the related elements. Rather, the best examples of the art of contemporary design have been the product of the collective effort of design disciplines and designers working together through acts of collaboration. Now, the word itself, collaboration, announces the possibility of mutual acts of design activity between design professionals, producing a richer and more stimulating form of practice. And at the same time, it also suggests a more sinister and subversive definition that includes incursions, encroachment, and occupation of professional territory. And these two definitions reflect what is considered to be the contradictory nature of collaboration, which can work both for and against any common aims of design, raising questions regarding the centers, edges, overlap, and the in-between of professional activity. The processes of true collaboration work in favor of designers such as Craig and Cristina, who can embrace projects and can use them as an opportunity to question both the professional boundaries between the design disciplines as well as the physical boundaries that the landscape and architecture professions have imposed, sometimes upon their own domains. Finally, I can think of no pair of individuals whose joint work best exemplifies Dan Kiley's words in raising people's level of consciousness and heightened awareness of the unity of nature, truth, beauty, and ourselves through design. To give the Daniel Urban Kiley Lecture for 2007, I'd ask you to welcome back to the GSD Craig Verzone and Cristina Woods.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Neil, for your warm and generous introduction, and for inviting us to give this year's Dan Kiley Lecture. It's a great honor and a very humbling experience. This evening we will show you some of our work over the past 12 years, since founding Verzone Woods Architectes in 1995. We will talk about the in-between on a number of different levels. Our studio has developed between two partners and different fields of practice, between two offices, urban and rural, between various cultures and countries, a few languages, and between being insiders and outsiders. In between is also a state of being for the Swiss and their landscape. Dorothee Imbert rightly referred to this in her introduction to the conference and exhibition on constructing the Swiss landscape here at the GSD last December. Switzerland, an island in Europe surrounded by a sea of recently united countries, embodies this condition. Within its borders, extreme contrasts of geology, geography, landscapes, history, culture, and traditions collide and exist within hyper-close proximity. This encounter of extremes, especially in the landscape, provides an obvious richness while heightening one's awareness and appreciation of the polarities. Mountain versus flatland, fluid versus solid, farm versus managed, and rural versus urban. The compressed seam between these polarities can be volatile and highly contested. It may and often does expand in a variety of growing middle grounds, or as Peter Rowe described, middle landscapes. These suffer from the pejorative connotations often associated with the in-between: mediocre, wishy-washy, undecided, neither here nor there, bland, dull, boring, just plain residual. This is where much of our work resides or takes root, trying to address and qualify the in-between, giving identity to the middle ground. Ours is an isolated yet mobile office. Its base is located in the Swiss Alps at an altitude of 3,000 feet in the parsonage of Rougemont, a small village of about 960 people, to which we feel proud to have added 3 more. As an antidote to this remoteness, we have developed a migratory pattern which in 6 hours travel places us in the center of Barcelona, Spain, a city of 3 million people. We're a small satellite office our outpost, used intermittently, allows us to follow our Spanish work. This large-scale commute, 4 to 6 times a year, also offers a geographical and cultural shift which inevitably catalyzes new thoughts and inspirations. These are our images of our rural Swiss studio and our urban Barcelona antenna. In the past years, our practice has taken us on many tangents. Our commissions have mostly been in Switzerland and Spain, although we have also worked on projects, indoor competitions, and installations in France, Germany, Italy, and the United States. This diagram shows project locations with black dots, and the chart indicates the ebb and flow per calendar year of colleagues in colors which indicate nationalities. Above the datum line, commissions in gray, and income, interestingly, in red, but not indicating net loss below the datum line. As you can see, the two of us worked on our own for the first half of our practice, and later with 2 to 8 other colleagues at any given time. Since 2000, we have set up a summer internship program which has brought 2 to 4 students each summer to our studio from 11 different countries to date. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all those who have worked with us for their contribution. Given our small size and intern programs, our mood and disposition is really dependent upon those who are with us. So as to encourage our interns to practice building early on, we've included as part of their program the realization of an ephemeral installation. This is a video of an installation we produced in 2004.
Now we'll take you on a brief flyover of the different types of jobs we've worked on. Then we'll share some thoughts about the work, and finally we'll show you 3 projects in greater detail. The purpose of the flyover is to give you a quick sense of the diversity of scales and topics we've been engaged with. There are 7 types of work: interventions in and around public icons, residential work, ephemeral installations, research, urban landscape, planning, and objects. In or around icons. These 2 projects bracket the dozen years we're talking about, since the redesign of the ground plane of Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation on the left, done in collaboration with Bruno Reichlin, really was at the beginning of our practice, and the interior renovation of the Château de Church on the right was inaugurated just 2 weeks ago. One is a controversial 20th century modern emblem, the other a village church built on the ruins of an early medieval fortress. In both cases, we responded to a building which carries iconic status within a community because of the cultural, social, and emotional baggage associated with its presence, its use and reuse, as well as its symbolic value. We will present the project of La Cité Radieuse in greater detail in the later part of this talk. Now I'll briefly describe the church, and this is the window I'll be referring to in the next slide. The intervention in the Château de Church was sparked by the parish's initiative to invest in a new organ. The western part of the church, shown here before construction, needed to be modified in order to accommodate the height and weight of the new instrument. This was an opportunity to improve certain spatial issues. The existing window in the western facade of the church, which we saw earlier from the outside, was entirely obliterated by the organ, which was backed up to it. The back of the church was dark, and the three existing pillars impaired visibility. The connection between the two upper levels was rather ungraceful. The removal of vertical supports and the new raked seating on the lower level provides better visibility as well as more intimate space for congregation, using just the back of the church. The two upper levels are now separated, giving them their independence and reinforcing their respective identities. Light from the west-facing window, which would be harmful to the instrument because of the temperature variations which it induces, is now redirected downwards by an inclined plane, bringing a gentle luminosity to the lower level. Here's the section showing the light, the window and the inclined plane. Here are the stairs and the railing details. The railing presents the most expressive face of the project. It sets up a dialogue between past and present, as it is inspired by the traditional craft of cut-out planks. The undulation of the surface gives a differentiated perspective depending on the point of view, sober or silent at times, and rippling or even sensual at others.
Residential. Over the years, we've undertaken more than 30 small-scale residential projects, single-family house or apartment renovations, as well as the design of private gardens. Here we will show you one of our most recent residential gardens located along the lake edge near Geneva. This garden for a new house on the southern edge of Lake Lemans was commissioned by the architect designing the house. She and her husband asked us to design a garden that would accompany her project and resolve some of the site-specific difficulties. The sloping site and the construction of a new house provide the topographic framework for this garden. The garden responds to the quadrants that the house sets up. To the east, an orchard frames the entry drive. To the north of the entry passage and reflecting pool, we designed a garden of drawers. To the south, a field of waves ties into a woodland edge, and between the house and lake, a planted slope. These different treatments of the ground plane in these four quadrants helps to structure the garden. Section A cuts through the drawer garden and cantilevered end of the house. The drawers relate to the more private rooms of the house. Section B cuts through the orchard, field of waves, and swimming pool. The orchard on the highest edge of the garden is composed of a variety of antique apple species. This mass helps screen the neighboring house and operates as an entry percolator to the field of waves. A square slope is enclosed by the house's cantilever, an entry bridge, and an existing line of linden trees. 7 large corten steel drawers are inserted into this green bank as plant containers. They're filled with aromatics, ferns, and large leaf perennials. The field of waves extends up from the kitchen terrace to the orchard, undulating along the neck of the house. The water's edge acts as a starting plane of a series of successive vegetative undulations which roll up the slope, flatten out around the house, and then continue along the site. This heavily planted slope along the lake poses as the garden's primary formal piece. Ironically, it falls away from the house and is best seen from the water. As in many classical French gardens found in the French-speaking world, the primary vegetative structure is composed of boxwood hedges. We've added a twist. Grassy striations and fill the voids of this boxwood fabric, and an assemblage of paths and linking stairs offer access to and from the lake. The stabilized gravel paths slip between the ornamental grasses and the boxwood striations, while also allowing for easier access to the lake edge. 2 pines were added to an existing in order to help filter the reflecting sun as it sets across the lake. The result is a contrast between the sober rectilinear geometry of the house placed within another new formal language, that of the water, the earth, and the plants.
Ephemeral work. We enjoy working on ephemeral installations, partly because it allows us to explore the margins between fields that we're interested in. We will overview two pieces, Garden of Silence and Field of 100 Pickets. Garden of Silence. This was the launching year of a garden festival in Cernier, Switzerland. The given theme was musical gardens, so we took the counterpoint and proposed a garden of silence. Ringed with a wall of hay bales, framing punctured views, light muted by a ceiling of woven jute, and footsteps muffled by a thick bed of wood chips. A few wired birdhouses intermittently whispered, "Shh."
Field of 100 Pickets. Oriented north-south and east-west. A grid of 100 pickets wraps the terrain, helping to represent the topography. As a fragment, it forms a foreground for the performance of the landscape beyond, transforming our regular yet non-ordinary views. As the background continues to change, the foreground stays the same. Sameness exposes and exaggerates difference. Difference is remembered, while sameness recedes. The unusual calls attention to that which has receded, the background. In the most beautiful landscapes, we face the biggest challenges. How can we regularly call attention to the receding background without impairing the integrity of the foreground? Perhaps it takes planting 100 pickets in a field. Versions of this installation were planted in 3 different locations: Rougemont, Switzerland, Buzzards Bay, Mass, and Rome, Italy. Research. Research is an important and all too often foreshortened step in the groundwork for design. It can also open our feet a realm of practice, as in the study of Rome's landscape of collective housing on the left, or serve as a way to explore ideas and satisfy curiosity, as in our podcast series, Terragrams, Delivering the Landscape. Outside Rome. During a year at the American Academy in Rome, I studied the landscape of post-war collective housing projects built on the Roman periphery. In search of space, light, air, and low land costs, Rome's post-war collective housing projects were pushed far away from the center and into the broad threshold between the historic city and the agricultural countryside. The relationship of the dwelling to its urban condition, to society, and to the land changed radically in this new marginal situation. Although new housing typologies ensued from extensive experimentation, their subsequent landscapes remain remarkably understudied and undesigned. Neither public nor private, neither park, square, nor garden, ambiguity has left many of these residual spaces unappropriated and lost. Still commonly lacking a resolution of vision, program, ownership, and identification, the landscape of housing in peripheral Rome demands greater attention. Terragrams, Delivering the Landscape. Terragram presents a series of interviews that open dialogue in the integral and all too often invisible role that landscape architecture plays in our lives. A first-hand conversation with the people who are making, designing, and thinking about our constructed landscapes. We launched Terragrams over a year ago in March 2006 with an interview with Julie Bargman of Dirt Studio and the support of the University of Virginia School of Architecture. We owe special thanks to the musicians who call themselves the Books for the use of some of their music. At this point, we've posted 8 interviews with Julie Bargman, Beth Figueres and Elias Torres from Barcelona, Jane Amadon from Ohio State University, James Corner, Michael Ferguson, Tom Campanella, and your very own Neil Kirkwood. These dispatches are accessible as podcasts through iTunes. We will continue collecting conversations and adding them to our series. On the way in May is a recent interview with Elizabeth Meyer. Additionally, please keep a lookout for our future interviews, which will include one with Robert Royston by Reuben Rainey, as well as another with the late Dan Urban Kiley, based on recorded conversations with Jane Amadon.
Urban landscape. In 2000, we began a rich and ongoing collaboration in the province of Aragon in northern Spain with architect Francisco Lacruz, whom we met here at the GSD. In 2006, he was awarded Spain's National Medal for the design of housing within the private sector. To date, we have worked on more than 30 built and unbuilt projects together. The new town of Las Margas on the left we will show in greater detail later on. On the right, the Padre Querdes Park, which was our first collaboration with Lacruz, is now nearing completion after 7 years. The public park and its corollary private gardens wrap 300 units of new housing on the expanding periphery of the city of Huesca. The commission included 3 types of spaces: the public park, to be built by the developer and handed over to the municipality; the semi-private areas, 3 inner courtyards for the 8-story buildings to the north of the street, as well as passageways through the housing along the south of the street, accessing the 3 bands of row houses. Finally, the 2 private swimming pool complexes for the use of the residents. The more enclosed areas, like this inner courtyard, provide a needed level of intimacy for the 700 to 800 residents of the neighborhood, while remaining connected to the public realm through the use of a common language, material, and color palette. The park itself is organized along 2 sinuous paths, one to the north of the project between the houses, and one to the south, which runs along a concrete perimeter wall to a small school. The southern edge of the park is composed of play zones, a water basin, and a paved square. To the east, we were able to preserve a pre-existing grove of trees, which now stands slightly raised above a hedge garden. This is the main entrance from the city. Finally, an interstitial terrain is sculpted into green terraces and terminates in a bosque of almond trees. These earth forms make reference to the local agrarian tradition of lightly leveling fields to facilitate pasture, planting, and irrigation. The different zones created by this terracing reinforce the zigzag path and frame the children's play spaces while also shifting the concentration of activity away from the attached houses. The hills, which are as high as 8 feet, allow for multiple perspectives and greater spatial definition to this zone. These landforms extend the effect of the volumetric stepping down, which we can see in the massing of the housing, denser and higher in the rear of the image and lower in the midground. Between the zigzag path and the row houses, the grass terraces create a modulated landscape, a solid rather than a void in terms of spatial identity, inscribing it as one of the park's most identifiable parts. We also can see the end of the passageways that feed the row houses. All houses are served by a common underground garage. The passages, therefore, allow mostly pedestrian access between the main entries to the left and the garden entries to the right. This space is intended to be appropriated by its inhabitants. Each passage has a line of trees of a different species. The colored bands on the street correspond with collective entrances and small sitting zones. We insisted upon qualifying the garden entrance as though it might be used regularly. Along the garden faces runs a canal which threads the passage into the park and the urban fabric. Based on the ancient tradition of irrigation in the province of Aragon, dating back to the Moorish occupation of the region, 4 sources of water in their canals feed the main basin. On the lower left are 2 images of the existing Spanish imperial canal, which flows not far from the site, and to the right some details of local irrigation techniques. The canal system was designed to be composed of prefabricated concrete modules, but in the end it was decided to have it poured in place. The final quality is not perfect, but satisfactory given the park's construction budget. At 3 of the 4 sources, we have designed simple boxes to serve as fountains. They are made of Corten steel. Completing the system, here's the basin which anchors the park at the main plaza. The bottom of the basin is filled with river stones and a few sunken planting circles for water lilies. The edge becomes a place to sit. The water is also used to irrigate the garden. At night, light boxes illuminate the outer edge of the park and basin, thus bringing some life to the imposed perimeter wall separating the park from the school. At the heart of the park, three elements come together: the basin, the plaza, and the bosque of pre-existing ailanthus trees. This zone becomes the threshold between the hedge garden and the zigzag path, which reaches into the park's interior. Along the rear wall of the park are short segments painted red. Here, despite the client's reluctance, we sited doors which were to be punctured into the schoolyard. Regularly disregarded during the design and construction process, we're happy to notice that they have now been constructed. And these doors are now gateways to roundabout detours for the children as they walk from one class period to the next. The hedge garden, although certainly not a horticultural winner, does offer a variety of spaces to play and relax. On the left, wide sidewalk tongues invite the public to infiltrate the garden and to try out one of the wooden platforms. Along the northern edge of the hedge garden, we conserved one line of linden trees and added a second to create a shady zone of repose. Under the trees are asymmetric picnic tables which are accessible for persons in wheelchairs or strollers. We're currently developing the table to be commercialized by the urban furniture company Escofet.
Which brings us to planning. We've worked on two larger-scale planning projects commissioned by different branches of the Swiss state administration. On the left, a landscape master plan for Switzerland's canton of Vaud, which we will see later on. On the right, a landscape and architectural inventory for the purpose of high-altitude property management in our alpine region. Recensement, the inventory. We were asked by the state agency that handles the maintenance of state properties to establish an inventory of publicly owned buildings sited in inaccessible locations and on currently non-constructible land. This consisted of over 70 buildings, mostly high-altitude farms or constructions linked to forestry. Each building and its siting were analyzed, documented, and mapped. They present varied levels of interest as historic artifacts, as witnesses of other times and economies, and in certain cases because of their exceptional siting. The report serves as a tool to guide the management and investment into these state-owned properties.
Objects. In most of our projects, we've found smaller details which have crystallized our attention. Often these have ended up in the design of objects or systems, which then can take on an independent course of their own. À ciel ouvert, or under open skies. A cultural event was planned in 2005 to animate the village of Rossinière during the summer months. It was to expose people to the practice of land art through a didactic exhibition and to encourage them to experiment with their own creations along a series of stops staged throughout the village where materials were made available. We were asked to design and site the containers for the raw materials. Trunk sections, wood shingles, river driftwood, spruce branches, river stones, and sand. Along with these containers, we proposed a system of snaking benches built by the local foresters. The design of the bench played on the contrast between the massive member and the pliable plank, the rigidity of one, the flexibility of another. As we continued our research in designing an alpine wooden bench, we devised another version inspired by the stacking and drying system used in local sawmills. After slicing the trunk, we hollowed out its center to insert a light. The Cité bench. Finally, this concrete bench was designed for the Unité d'Habitation project. It's based on Le Corbusier's modular, and its design allows for double-sided yet oriented use, since the slots are not centered, and this makes the depth and inclination of the seat perceptibly different on either side. The slots allow for water to drain from above and for indirect light to shine through from below, when the bench is combined with a floor projector. The benches can be installed individually or as a series of increments. After the Cité project was realized, the Barcelona company Escafet decided to commercialize it.
And this brings us to the end of the flyover. The diversity of scales at which we practice is one of the fundamental flaws of our studio, and if one thinks purely in terms of efficiency. However, it's one of the reasons why we enjoy our practice, and we find it keeps our minds nimbler. So we accept it as a chosen flaw, of which there are quite a few. Before delving into 3 projects in greater detail, we'd like to submit to you a few thoughts. So here are our top 10. To find the solution, one must first identify the problem. The final solution is normally the most obvious. The most beautiful ideas are the unexpected ones. Number 7, fine craftsmanship is nice, but not necessary. We interpret the mundane, design between abstract and figuration, start with the ground plane. Coming in at number 3, a plan is meaningless without its details. Landscape and architecture are reciprocal pursuits. And finally, number 1 of the VW Top 10, practice is trial and error. But as in much of what we could do, we could not just stick to 10, so here are a couple extras. 11, every project needs an inside advocate. 12, choose your battles. And finally, 13, there's only so much you can do from a distance.
Okay, now we'll show you Cadrage, a landscape master plan for the Canton of Vaud, Switzerland. Switzerland is composed of 23 cantons. The Canton of Vaud lies in the western French-speaking region. It borders the Canton of Geneva, France, and the cantons of Neuchâtel, Fribourg, Berne, and Valais. It presents a sampling of the 3 main geomorphological components of the country: the Jura mountain range to the west, the Moyen Pays or plateau in the center, and the Alps to the east. The canton is in the process of revising its master plan and decided for the first time to commission a landscape study focused on the territory's rural landscape, embracing close to 3,000 square kilometers and a range and altitude of almost 3,000 meters. We put together and piloted a team composed of a historian, a geographer, an agronomist, another landscape architect, a photographer, the graphic designers at Actar, and our office. The purpose of the study was to assess the current state and diversity of landscapes and to anticipate the major issues confronting the evolution of the landscape in the next generation. The final report was structured into 4 booklets, which could be velcroed into a sleeve in 2 different ways. This diagram of the report shows the various parts of the study. We'll go over them part by part. Drifting across the territory, collecting first-hand observations. And the identification of 24 landscapes of reference in Volume 1. The creation of a palette of landscape typologies in Volume 2. Volume 3 presents and carries a DVD of films made by the photographer. And all of these led to Volume 4, identifying the challenges of the future and addressing them through some pilot projects. These 4 volumes cross-reference one another and are therefore meant to be used in conjunction. Hence the binding concept, which allows all 4 to open up at once. Volume 1, Existing Conditions. So as to highlight the evolution, or lack thereof in certain cases, the photographer collected old postcards from the early 20th century and returned to the same spots to get the identical point of view. Here's another example. Then, drifting. This shows the rest of our team's drifting and gathering process. We gave a 12-year-old the task of mapping out roads of varying typologies from highways down to unpaved lanes and of determining our stops randomly every 10 kilometers at these locations. We collected information. Photographic panoramas as well as collective sketches. These were created by layering onto the same drawing the components of the landscape, topography, water, buildings, and vegetation, captured in sequence by different people, an exquisite corpse of sorts. I owe this idea to Carol Bolsay, who taught me so much at the Carpenter Center and at the GSD many years ago. These sketches are shown here, interjected between the photographic documentation and the contrast between what the camera captures and what eyes and hands record is at times quite poignant. After this gathering process, the identification of 24 landscapes of reference across the different geographic landscape entities of the canton that we also battled over as we determined what was in fact a landscape entity. Each landscape of reference was presented as follows: a diagram cross-referencing to the palette of typologies relative to its components, a locator map and a list of salient characteristics of this specific landscape, then a representative image and some of those collective sketches, some more images, and a text by the historian about how this landscape came to be, and by the agronomist about how it is currently managed. Finally, an ideogram summarized in a more interpretive manner the qualities of this specific landscape. Here is a second example in the Jura region, just to give you a sense. And there are 24 of these. Volume 2, Landscape Typologies. This shows the organization and color coding of the palette of landscape typologies by classification into 7 deliberately non-scientific categories: rock, water, grasslands, trees, agriculture, human habitation, and infrastructure. The identification of the typologies was done from a purely empirical point of view, avoiding professional jargon from any field as much as possible. It's based on the observation of the aerial photograph and the ability for non-specialists to discern the type of landscape in question at a scale of 1 to 10,000, since each image represents a 1 kilometer square. At the center, the extracted aerial image. To its left, a doctored image, graphically highlighting its essence. To its right, a probable locator icon, the title and main characteristics of the type relative to fauna and flora, water, constructions, infrastructure, and uses. And finally, the code and name of the type. Here are a few examples, and accompanying the information was always a perspective image, giving you a view from the ground, contrasted to the view from the sky. Wooded pastures, intensive orchards, semi-collective housing, and finally this brings us to Volume 3, Landscape and Movement, presenting 2 different kinds of films by Nicolas Savary. 5 short films covering the landscape as perceived from different modes of transportation, and a series of film panoramas taken from a rotating platform. These images refer to the panoramas, and these introduce the 5 short films. I wish I could show you the films because they're really wonderful. There just isn't time for all of it. This brings us to Volume 4, which focused on issues and pilot projects. Here's a preliminary mapping of the landscape issues we addressed. On the upper left, spaces in which natural dynamics still play a major role, mostly forests and rivers. On the upper right, current urbanization in black, fastest growing areas in red, the lake edge and the axis between the 2 major cities, Lausanne and Yverdon. And in pink, probable next areas of development, as population is expected to grow by 20% over the next 25 years. On the lower left, a combined map also showing the issues facing agriculture. Competitiveness on a global market for the areas in green, on the plateau mostly, and traditional mountain farming and its role in maintaining the landscape in yellow. Finally, on the lower right, the siting of our pilot projects. As you can see in the zoom, there are areas where many of the pilot projects overlap. We analyzed the issues and tried to organize them into families: landscape in relation to nature and agriculture, development, mobility, and transversal issues having to do with sustainability. Within each family, we identified some themes which spark a few pseudo-naive questions, which in turn lead to some schematic pilot projects or to some further thoughts. Here's an example of those questions which serve as springboards to pilot projects. What if the rural landscape remained open and diverse? Encourage transversal swaths across the plateau. What if the lake edge landscapes remained connected to their backcountry? Maintain landscape swaths so as to frame urban development. This shows the transversal swaths in yellow across the plateau and the smaller scale lake edge ones in orange on the Lake Léman to the south and Lac de Neuchâtel to the north. The process by which we identified the strategy includes, on the left, locating the existing villages and threading a swath in yellow across the more open areas. On the right, deducing the areas where densification through urbanization or reforestation is favored. To consider the implementation of this planning strategy, we studied this test patch, highlighting the critical components which impact the process or become primary actors in perpetuating the openness and vitality of the landscape swath. Villages, orchards, isolated farms, road and rail lines, bridges, paths, waterways, wetlands, forest patches, etc. For the lake edge swaths, we proposed a 4-part strategy, which includes protecting the primary landscape components, restitching the pedestrian connections, articulating the edges, and densifying development around the swath. What if we enhanced the strengths of our river corridors? Use riverways as structuring systems in the landscape to create local networks. This question was illustrated by a pilot project about the promontours. In the case of the promontours, we proposed small interventions strategically located according to the existing infrastructures so as to strengthen the connectivity of the riverway. What if 2 separate but adjacent towns coordinated their growth? Qualify the meeting ground of their peripheries through landscape intervention and urbanization of different densities. The growth of 2 towns, Aube and Chavornay, only a couple of kilometers apart, was studied, proposing a strategy of expansion as well as the preservation of some agricultural land of different types, orchards, vineyards, peri-urban agriculture, greenhouses, etc., and wetlands to become the structuring open spaces of the future conurbation. What if a traditional village needed to grow? Create new housing without destroying the transition to the surrounding countryside. Here we proposed a series of strategies to densify and extend small villages while also attending to the distinct landscape qualities of the encounter between village and countryside. Identifying the existing anchor points or elements which structure the edge, buildings, intersections, vegetation. Suggesting anchor points where they're missing. Conserving important openings from the village into the landscape and vice versa. Proposing the reinforcement of typical transitional landscapes, community gardens, orchards, etc. Proposing a variety of densification and construction strategies to avoid sprawl. What if we couldn't waste our land? Found new dense villages connected to public transportation rather than allowing existing peripheries to sprawl. We proposed a revolutionary idea with regard to Swiss mentality, the creation of a town from scratch. No historical precedent, just the selection of a site based on its landscape qualities and its location potential. This was heresy to the Swiss. These are high-density new centralities which continue the pattern of small, dense nuclei. We found 10 potential sites for these new towns. Here are a couple of examples. What if our highways were beautiful? Consider them as parkways. Our pilot project addressed the first highway built in Switzerland in 1964 along the northern edge of Lake Léman for the International Expo, which took place in Lausanne. This road traverses exceptionally beautiful landscapes, but it ignores its immediate landscape. Or at times, in an attempt to make itself more discreet, it devalues its potential as an important piece, both as a part of and in the apprehension of the larger scenery. What if we encouraged sustainable projects on agricultural land? What if indigenous energy were cheaper than imported energy? What if renewable energy production facilities became attractions? Link renewable energy, tourism, and agriculture by making them mutually supportive. A local farm with solar fields sells its products directly and joins a small-scale camping network. The production of energy is not considered an agricultural activity in Switzerland, or hasn't been up until now, so it was forbidden on agricultural land. But that law has just been changed, so we're happy to find that out. A combination of wind farming, existing and new leisure activities, and the reuse of a military fort. This is an actual combination that would be possible in our region if it weren't for other obstacles. A couple of larger environmental topics were addressed. What if forests became more multifunctional? Are Swiss forests being among the most heavily managed ever since the inception of the oldest laws on forests? What if water were precious along its entire course? Our village, at 1,000 meters and close to some glaciers, has run into drought over the past few years. Awareness is growing, even at the pinnacle of water supply. What if we learned landscape in school? Teach landscape to educate future generations of decision makers. By school, we meant high school, or middle school, or even elementary school. In the end, this would be our greatest ambition, that the work from this study could serve as a pedagogical tool.
This brings us back to northern Spain to look at Las Margas, the Badlands. This project is sparked by the booming economy and housing construction and the desire for middle-class Spaniards to attain a second house either in the mountains or near the sea, in this case, near the mountains. The site, located in the northernmost region of Aragon, sits at the cross-axis of a horizontal fold in the Pyrenees topography. 30 minutes north are some of the geologically richest national parks in Spain. It is the largest project our office has worked on, containing nearly 10 different, very low-paying commissions. We started in 2001, and construction will most likely continue until 2015 or 20 or 25. It is situated on a greenfield, what once was an agricultural plateau highlighted in orange, below a small village called Latas. The visual connection to the mountains and the access laterally to other mountain valleys was a determining factor for its location. The parcel rests within the metropolitan borders of the industrial village called Sabiñánigo. With a population of 9,000 people, our new village will increase Sabiñánigo's size by 150% in the next 20 years. In the inset, you can see the importance of the lowest folds of the Pyrenees. The parcel of land overlooks a meander in the river Gallego and sits at 1,800 feet elevation. This project combines an ambitious program of 2,200 units of new housing, 27 holes of golf, a clubhouse, and hotel, restaurant, commercial spaces, 3 schools, multiple social cultural centers, public sports fields and courts, and a series of 4 semi-public swimming facilities. The 650-acre site will also include 50 acres of public parks and private gardens and 150 acres of natural reserve. Given the importance of the region's natural resources, rich vernacular language, the project has grown from our team's initial ecological and architectural studies of the area. The map on the left shows the site of the project and its relationship to the network of walking and biking paths. One tributary for the pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela runs just a kilometer south of Latas. The slide on the right situates the site within its geological context at the end of the glacial valley. The last glacier pushed down to the edge of the site, leaving deposits, blocks, and large zones of glacial sedimentation, which have since gone through centuries of erosion. These infertile zones wrap the site and give us the name of the project, Las Margas, or the Badlands. They also give us a conceptual springboard. The project consists of 2 villages, each with plateau typologies and hillside typologies. Sorting the villages together is a linear park system which stretches over 5 miles long, expanding and contracting to accommodate different site, spatial, and programmatic conditions. This aerial photo taken from the west shows much of the site of Las Margas in the foreground, agricultural terrain, mid-ground, adjacent to the river and a torrent, and along the opposite bank, the city of Sabiñánigo, anchored at the foot of a geological fold which resembles a long spinal column. This aerial photo, taken from the southeast, shows the Pyrenees in the background. In the lower image, we see the access road to the first half of the new villages. Zooming in on the project, we see the first phases of construction with a hotel, restaurant, and clubhouse to the lower right, and the first 2 fingers of housing in the center. One approaches the village via the entry road, which is situated on the upper right. The entry road is paralleled by 2 pedestrian paths. These paths converge and the promenade widens to interlace 5 water reservoirs on the right of the image. The reservoirs help situate the hotel and clubhouse. On the opposite side of the entry road, the housing blocks branch out along 3 roads. Between these blocks will be 2 terraced fingers of park, which fall down to the north, opening up views to the Pyrenees, to the left of this image. In between the golf course and the housing, we've tried weaving in the continuation of the public promenade, which wraps the lakes. In addition, parking and public sports complex and a swimming pool will be interlaced. Within this promenade, a series of 4 small meeting spaces, or plazas, penetrate the outer edge of housing and close the connection towards the 2 terraced fingers. Here the plan highlights our first phase of public space construction and more clearly shows the roads, the water reservoirs, the promenade along the reservoirs, the promenade along the edge of the housing, and the green fingers. With the plan rotated 90 degrees with north now oriented up, I'd like to walk you along the edges of the reservoirs. They're the principal organs of the place. The hydrologic infrastructure becomes the spatial framework to the public realm, only if you can say it. The reservoirs are bound by paths, stairs, and ramps. The parcels in white will eventually be occupied by 3 unknown, multivalent socio-cultural commercial buildings. We were confronted with 3 problems. How do we resolve the need to retain 1/3 the necessary volume of water for the site irrigation, remembering that there's a golf course on the south side? How do we create a cohesive structure for the public space, which must drop 40 feet transversely from the east to the west, while also including flexibility to these 3 unknown parcels of land? And finally, perhaps most importantly, how do we invent an identity for this new greenfield village working within a space squeezed between a landscape of housing and one of leisure, golf, and mostly detached from its geographic context? We looked at the Badlands, which enveloped the site, to begin developing a language of spatial complexity for our lake edges, ground planes, and paths. Topographically, we finally performed a simple cut and fill in order to move the least amount of earth while at the same time making the deepest pockets of water. The promenade wraps each lake to stitch them into the park network. The reservoirs are variations of one another, which have been slipped in order to diversify the spatial qualities of the edge conditions. Sectionally, these layers are stacked up to mitigate the height differences of the site. At the upper end of the water sequence, a source of water marks the head and widening of our principal promenade from the entry road and linear park. This water source, together with a small open-air theater, flank a long ramp, thus defining the urban aperture into the park network. The stacked Corten steel risers frame small stabilized gravel terraces which get populated by cypress trees and the project's modular tube lamps. The ramp provides handicap accessibility to the lake edges as well as to the terraces. Two different Corten steel step typologies are infilled with concrete to provide access between the platforms. Like many of the other elements of the park system, they were repeated and mutated. This is what makes it efficient. Here are a few images of the theater in access slope into the landscape surrounding the reservoirs. The transition between the reservoirs repeat themselves while also mutating to their specific conditions. 10 feet of elevation separate each edge of the basins of water, and it is this seam which becomes the most valuable vertical and horizontal intersection in the project. Here we have the intersection of the promenade, stairs, and lake. The construction plans on top of this image show the three mutations of this transition between the lake levels. The stepping handrail on the bottom left, perhaps an example of designing between figuration and abstraction. And here we see a few variations in the cascading Corten steel stairs during construction. And again, here's one of the four transitions between the reservoirs. We tried taking advantage of the possibilities of having these large bodies of water and all of this water edge in the project. On the left, a bent dock extends over the water. In the center, a cascade between this dock and an island on the right, a cascade joins the two lakes. And the island itself punctuates one of the lakes, which is 15 to 20 feet deep. Below left is a drawing of a large Pyrenean hydraulic control point, and to the right is an existing set of cascades built recently to manage the seasonal surges of a nearby torrent. From the hotel terrace, you can see the four cascades between the cloudlets, the retention slope, walls, and borders. This vertical striation is also visible on the hillside but beyond. The center image on the bottom begins to reveal the results of our planimetric gymnastics and section moves, one of my favorite moments for the project. Set into lakes are zones for aquatic plants and trees. A boardwalk crosses through the zone of taxodium trees to bring one out on top of the body of water. The hotel in the background is superimposed atop a clubhouse, which is buried and integrated into the terrain. These sections are cut through the cascades, which allow the water to flow from one reservoir to the next. The cascades will be sheathed in an open skin of steel platelets, hopefully, in order to aggravate the water as it passes between the two cisterns. The dikes are composed of four components: a lower path, an inclined Corten steel border, a gentle slope of grass, and a low stone retention wall and upper path. The upper path of the dike, the grassy slope. When viewed frontally, especially during the construction process, the layers became stacked. In perspective, the horizontal planes are layered. The transversal paths extend the full length of the reservoirs and all originate from the principal promenade. The intersection between the transversal path and promenade open up to make the small plazas. For the principal promenade, we've designed a prefabricated concrete paver. It is a simple square paver with 5 lines traced across the surface. When rotated randomly, the individual paver disappears as the lines on the adjacent pavers interconnect to create a larger pattern of random scribbles. Particular places in the water edge park include an island, which marks overlooks the upper lake. And a bent dock which slips through a grove of Texodium trees and hovers just slightly above the water. Terminating the promenade along the lake, a small gravel plaza is covered with a bosque of native trees and a small building for a cafe and kiosk. This is the joint between the hotel, restaurant, clubhouse, the multivalent parcels, and the promenade which continues north along the edge of the housing. Here we see the full composition of reservoirs, promenade, hotel, and housing. Floating within the fabric of our long path are these polyvalent parcels. Not knowing what they would become, it was a challenge designing around them. The passages between these parcels lead to the elongated residential blocks and the green fingers between them. The red dashed lines correspond to the pedestrian passages under the buildings and through the outer layer of the residential block. Note how the buildings densify along the edge of the entry road. They span the streets and are opened at the ground plane to the finger parks. Looking back in the village from the north, we can see the residential spines between which will be built the green fingers. Also on the right of the image is the promenade which weaves between the housing and sports facilities. Before I continue talking about the promenade, let's look briefly at the green fingers which rest inside and between the residential blocks. As they are oriented to the north, they bring in and open up the views to the Pyrenees for the houses. Our intention here was to retain some of the pre-existing qualities of the site, its openness and topographic stratification. Looking back on the village from the north, we can see the residential spines The green fingers are modulated or broken up in a similar fashion as housing is. We wanted them to be porous. Cross-circulation was a vital component, as was circulation along the privatized edges. Little planting is done in order to preserve the views from the houses to the Pyrenees. Small puddles of concrete are dripped onto the green fingers. They're peppered with our prototypical picnic table that we saw in the park in Huesca in one condition, and a wooden bench and stone plinth in another condition. This shows a relationship between the promenade and internal green finger. Parking to the left, then the promenade and a transversal pocket park, an internal road, and the green finger park on the right. A few sketches indicate organizational strategy of the outer edge, promenade and finger parks. Zooming out, we see the relationship between the 3 internal streets and 2 green finger parks. Tying these north-south axes to the western edge are a series of 4 small pocket park composites. Before working on the mutations, we developed the prototype. On the left, vegetal scheme. On the right, pedestrian connections. The planting strategy. And finally, the vegetational volume and character. These pocket park composites consist of a small plaza and tree grove, masses of ornamental grasses and perennials, a children's playground, and a small lawn. These are serial in nature and repeat themselves along our path. Here are 3 of the 4 iterations. They're structured vertically by a repetition of our modular tube lights. Which brings us to the project's lighting. Early in the development process, we became rather preoccupied with lighting. Unsatisfied with what was in the market, we figured we could design a fixture for the project. Our intention was to keep it simple and cheap. For our first fixture, we used a 16-centimeter square steel tube and called it the Badlands A lamp. When we learned that the Badlands A would save money on the project because of its low cost, we figured the developer would agree to an angled version of Badlands B. This approach led to 2 more iterations. We imagined applying simple operations to our Badlands A. We cut, we welded them, giving us Badlands C, D, and E, with variations to lamps A and D, giving us A2 and D2. Here are models A through D. soon deframe the paths from the lakes. So we made some more street lamps, and small plaza lamps, and big plaza lamps, and lit bollards. This gave us models Badlands F, I, J, K with variations X and Y. And finally we added G and H for the linear park and entry road. However, the steel tubes came in structurally handy in helping us design a cafe, bus stop, and shade structure. Here's the shade structure that weighs its bench component. Then we used a Badlands 16cm tube to help us bring some low-level lighting to the terraces of the restaurant and hotel. These bent Badlands lamps then contaminated our handrail detail to the right, thus allowing us to avoid any redundant systems while saving money on supports and space. Here we see the handrail of the hotel which wraps around the balconies and originates along the edge of the lakes. On the left, the bulging foot is waiting for its corresponding light tube, and on the right, a few variations of the light tube and handrail. I zoom out to show you the first phases of construction. The central village will be complete in 3 years, and the others perhaps within the next decade or two.
This is the last project we'll show you. Well, almost there. In 1996, the city of Briey asked Bruno Reichlin and ourselves to study the ground plane at the Cité Radieuse in Briey-en-Forêt, France, Le Corbusier's unité d'habitation. The design for this project couldn't happen responsibly without a significant amount of research into Le Corbusier's archives in Paris to try to identify what his approach might have been. This shows a comparison of the scale and siting differences of the only 5 constructed unités. The Marseille unité carries the fame. It's portrayed in the lower right. But its 4 lesser-known younger siblings are still alive and well. The fact that 5 versions of this prototype were built on 5 very different sites yields the opportunity for comparative research. You see one in Nantes, one in Berlin, the one in Briey that we dealt with, the one in Firminy, and the one in Marseille that everyone knows. This image shows 5 redrawn site plans of the over 75 different ones existing at the Le Corbusier archive in Paris. The research focused on extracting from these documents a design intention relative to the insertion of the machine in the garden. A Swiss government research grant supported this work. The 4th unité d'habitation started construction in 1961 in Briey-en-Forêt, a small town of 5,000 people, which holds the end of an important body of forest in the Lorraine region of eastern France, near the cities of Metz and Nancy. The housing bar is sited on the upper plateau of a river valley in a clearing looming high above a mature stand of European beech trees. It's an exceptional site. This is the last version of the site plan which came out of Le Corbusier's office. It shows the combination of programs which were intended on the site and which never got built. Parking in the forest in light pink, a supermarket, a cinema and other commercial programs, and lower density housing. What ended up happening, as in most of the built unités, is that the additional programs were truncated and only the housing bar was built. None of the projects were fully completed according to Le Corbusier's vision. The parking lot was simply installed where the staging zone for construction had been, right at the foot of the eastern facade, occupying the floor of the clearing. The machine did not stand in the garden, but rather in a parking lot, as you can see in the top image. The lower images show the same ground plane after the relocation of the parking. A view from the building above before our intervention, and the same view after. In order to free the ground plane from the car, the parking was programmed into 2 long bands cut into the forest to the north of the building. A plaza was created as a transitional public space between the parking and entrance. A lawn took the place of the old parking lot. An orchard was planted to anchor the southern end of the site. These are some images of the construction process: the demolition of the existing parking lot, the grading and subsurface work for the new parking lot, the laying of the perforated pavers, facilitating infiltration, the subsurface work and laying of the stone paving on the main pedestrian connection to the parking, the prefabricated concrete bollards, which are in fact simply poured into traffic cones, the laying of borders, bollards, and lighting in the plaza, the lighting and resurfacing of the underbelly of the building, the slabs of stone for the surfacing of the main pedestrian ways. This is the circulation plan. It shows the vehicular circulation, access road, turnaround, and parking. The pedestrian surfaces of the plaza, the two principal perpendicular alleys, the zone under the building, and the paths across the garden. This shows the circulation strip in asphalt and the parking bands in perforated paver. This is the lighting plan. The parking is lit with a broad ceiling of lamps. The new plaza inversely is floor lit by embedded lamps laid in a grid distorted by the bulge of the turnaround. The main access road is lit by street lamps up to the threshold of the parking entry road. Then low indirect pedestrian lighting takes over from floor projectors placed under benches. The elevator core, with its low relief indicating the main entrance, is lit from the ground, as is the underbelly. Two standing lamps mark path junctures in the garden. Here we see the lit ceiling juxtaposed with the lit floor plane. For the choice of standing lamp fixture, we dug up the model which Le Corbusier himself had specified. The company Eclatec was still producing this model, but just about to retire it, and they couldn't understand why we would want something so outdated. The transition from vehicular street lighting to pedestrian indirect floor lighting. The inclinations of the planes under the bench was studied so that they would act as diffusers to shed light as far as possible across the floor. The elevator core and low relief lit from the ground. The underbelly of the building. The approach by night and by day. This is the planting plan. In order to preserve the vitality of the beech forest, we proposed that 1,500 beech of diverse ages be underplanted within the mature but partially decaying canopy, so as to perpetuate its character. Unfortunately, this part was significantly cut back as the foresters determined that the maintenance of the forest was of their register, not ours. They advocated underplanting of only seedlings of diverse species in the clearings created by fallen trees, bringing about a move away from the beech monoculture planted over 80 years ago. Other than this planting scheme remains very sober. A double row of plane trees facing the plaza, 5 modest planting beds of aromatics and bulbs, a freestanding tulip tree in the lawn, and the apple orchard in a prairie to the south. The bulbs in the strip between the parking bands, the poppy prairie at the foot of the orchard, and the 5 planting beds of aromatics and bulbs, which unfortunately have been erased as their maintenance was considered too much of a burden, despite their modesty. Here we see the double row of plane trees as a transition from forest to plaza. These images show the site in wintertime. This project was an eye-opener for us in more ways than one. It was essential to conceive of the appropriate foreground for such an icon, strong enough to hold the building, yet discreet enough not to rival it, balancing between those opposites. We collaborated with a pure and true academic, and the association with a local engineer proved extremely difficult, reinforcing the need to choose our battles. But we did have our insider advocate in the right-hand man to the mayor, who had grown up in the building as a child and was determined to see the project through. Finally, our first piece of urban furniture grew out of the project. So as our pedestrian approaches the Cité Radieuse, we conclude our presentation. And I would say that our conceptual process is one of both and rather than either or. We work not from within each of our disciplines, but across them. We approach both the macro scale and the micro scale simultaneously and with the same level of attention. We aim to draw inspiration from tradition, but also to innovate, to learn from and strengthen natural systems, but also acknowledge human intervention, to use an abstract, yet figuratively resonant formal language, and to create sober yet sensual environments. In exploring the in-between, we try to combine polar opposites rather than accept them as mutually incompatible. Thank you for your attention.
Just two quick announcements for the students in the audience. There will be a conversation with Craig. Craig Verzone will be available on lunchtime on Friday to meet with students and to enter into a dialogue and discussion about aspects of the presentation or anything else that's on your mind. But tonight I'd like to invite you all to join us for a reception in the Portico Rooms to honor tonight's speakers, Craig Verzone and Cristina Woods. Thank you.
So I'm just going to go upstairs and get my bag and hear what the other is. Yeah. Great.